In 1878, miners on the Comstock Lode in Nevada broke through to the 3,000-foot level and entered a kind of hell. Rock temperature exceeded 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked 15-minute shifts before being hauled up semi-conscious and packed in ice delivered underground by the ton daily. The Consolidated Virginia Mining Company spent more on cooling its workforce than on paying them. Then William Sharon's crew hit water, not a seep, not a damp pocket, an underground reservoir at near boiling temperature that blasted into the shaft and flooded the lower levels within hours. The Cornish pumps could not keep up. The mine was evacuated. But before the water reached the working levels, 3 men from the night shift told their foreman what they had seen at the last face. A wall. Not rock, not ore, not a natural formation. A vertical surface of stone, smooth, with regular texture matching nothing in Mount Davidson's geology. One of the 3, an Irishman named O'Brien, said, "That is not rock, that is masonry." The foreman recorded it in the shift log. That log survives in the Nevada Bureau of Mines archives in Carson City. But nobody went back. The pumps ran 3 months. When the levels were dry, the company decided not to resume in that direction. The shaft was plugged with concrete. The 3 miners were off the payroll within a year, none leaving a written account beyond that single entry. The wall is still there, behind concrete, at 3,000 feet beneath a mountain officially containing nothing but silver, gold, and volcanic rock. The Comstock Lode is a vein of silver and gold ore running through Mount Davidson in western Nevada, near Virginia City. Discovered in 1859, it triggered the largest silver rush in American history. By the 1870s, Virginia City was one of the wealthiest communities on Earth, and the mines beneath it were the deepest in the Western Hemisphere. The operation employed over 3,000 men underground and pioneered technologies that would define deep mining for the next century: square-set timbering to support unstable ground, Cornish pumps capable of lifting millions of gallons daily, cage hoists that dropped men half a mile into the earth in minutes. The capital invested in the Comstock dwarfed anything previously seen in American mining. Individual shafts cost more to sink than entire railroad lines cost to build. The geology is volcanic. Mount Davidson sits in the Virginia Range, formed by tertiary-age volcanic activity. The ore body occupies a fault zone where hydrothermal fluids deposited silver and gold in shattered quartz. As miners followed the ore downward, they met conditions that pushed every limit of 19th century engineering. Heat increased roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit per 30 feet of depth. At 1,500 feet, the rock was warm. At 2,000, it was hot enough to blister skin on contact. At 2,500, men fainted after minutes of exertion. At 3,000, the companies were spending fortunes on ice, compressed air, and ventilation just to keep the workforce alive long enough to swing a pick. The Sutro Tunnel, a 4-mile horizontal bore from the valley floor into the mountain's base, was completed in 1878, partly to drain and ventilate the deepest workings. But heat was only half the problem. The volcanic geology created fractured rock through which geothermal water circulated at temperatures approaching boiling. As shafts went deeper, they intersected these superheated aquifers at unpredictable intervals. Flooding was a constant threat. The 1878 breach at 3,000 feet was not the first time a Comstock shaft hit water, but it was the deepest, the hottest, and according to 3 miners who saw the last face before the section was sealed, it was the first time the water was not the only discovery worth recording. The three miners are partially recoverable from Comstock employment records. O'Brien appears on the Consolidated Virginia payroll for 1877 and 1878 as a driller, meaning he worked at the face, the furthest point of excavation. The other two are identified only by last names, Kowalski and Reeves. All three were experienced deep miners who knew the difference between natural rock and something that did not belong. The shift log entry, written by foreman James Hennessy, is brief. It notes the time of the water breach, the rate of flooding, the evacuation order. At the bottom, in a separate paragraph, Hennessy writes that 3 men from the advancing face reported a smooth stone surface perpendicular to the drift before the water came through. He records O'Brien's masonry statement without comment. Hennessy's log is an operational record, not a scientific report. The entry about the wall sits alongside pump pressures and equipment losses embedded in the mundane paperwork of a mining emergency. Nobody thought to remove it because nobody considered a foreman's note about anomalous rock significant enough to suppress. The suppression came later, when the company chose not to reopen that section. The concrete plug sealed a dangerous area, and the wall became collateral damage of an engineering decision. The 3 men who saw it were scattered into the anonymous labour force of the West within a year. Mount Davidson's volcanic geology produces features every Comstock miner learned to recognise. Fracture planes in andesite are rough and irregular. Quartz veins run at angles set by hydrothermal deposition. Clay gouge zones are soft and crumbling. None produce a smooth, vertical surface with regular texture. O'Brien used the word masonry. Hennessy recorded it without dispute. Masonry implies fitted stone, blocks, courses, deliberate construction. At 3,000 feet in rock dated to the Miocene 10 to 15 million years ago, that is a geological impossibility. The standard responses are predictable: a natural joint plane that looked regular in lamplight, a dike with smooth surfaces from differential weathering, a stress-polished fault face. Each is plausible in the abstract. None account for the detail O'Brien reported: regular texture. A joint plane is smooth but featureless. A dike has crystalline texture from its cooling rate. A stress surface has slickened sides, directional grooves from fault movement. Regular texture is none of these. It implies pattern, repetition, structure, something a driller who had spent years staring at rock faces would distinguish from every natural surface he had ever seen. O'Brien was not a geologist, but he knew rock. He knew what andesite looked like at every angle, under every kind of lamplight, and he looked at this surface and said it was not rock. The water came before anyone could examine it closely. The concrete came before the water was fully drained. The water that flooded the 3,000-foot level was geothermal, heated to near boiling. It came under pressure, meaning the reservoir behind it was larger and deeper than the mine. The flow overwhelmed the pumps within hours. Lower levels filled from the bottom up as miners retreated, pulling equipment. The pumps ran 3 months, removing over 3 million gallons daily and barely keeping pace. When the water was controlled, the company faced a choice: reopen and accept the risk of another breach in extreme heat, or seal the section and focus on safer workings. They sealed. The decision was economic. Nobody was thinking about walls or masonry. They were thinking about pumping costs and shareholder returns. The concrete plug filled approximately 200 feet of drift, permanently closing access to the section where the breach occurred. The concrete was mixed on the surface and lowered in buckets, poured in stages to ensure it sat properly in the geothermal heat. Workers who poured the plug later recalled that the temperature at the face was still high enough to make the concrete cure faster than normal, which meant the seal was harder and more permanent than a standard plug. What was unusual was the speed. Normally, a sealed section would first be surveyed and assessed. The 3,000-foot section was plugged without a formal geological report. No samples were taken from near the reported wall. No engineer was sent to examine what the three miners described. The section went from active to sealed in less than 2 weeks. And once the concrete set, whatever O'Brien had seen was beyond reach. The Sutro Tunnel deserves its own chapter because it provides an independent geological cross-section of Mount Davidson. Begun in 1869 and completed in 1878, it was a 4-mile horizontal bore from the Carson Valley floor into the mountain's base at roughly the 1,650-foot mine level. Its purpose was drainage, ventilation and ore transport, and it was the most ambitious mining infrastructure project in 19th century America. As the tunnel advanced, bore crews kept geological logs, now preserved in the Sutro Tunnel Company records at the Nevada State Archives. These logs describe the rock foot by foot: andesite, rhyolite, fault breccia, clay gouge, quartz veins, and occasional pockets of hot water. The precision of the logs reflects the fact that the tunnel's investors demanded constant updates on ground conditions, which means every anomaly was recorded, whether or not it was understood. At 3 separate points along the tunnel's path, bore crews recorded encountering anomalous formations. In each case, the log notes rock that did not match the expected geological sequence. One entry describes unusually regular fracturing that the crew initially mistook for an old working, before determining no prior mining had occurred in that area. Another notes shaped stone fragments in a clay matrix that the shift engineer attributed to natural spalling, but flagged as unusual, noting the fragments had flat faces on opposing sides. A third records a smooth planar surface crossing the bore at an oblique angle, described as unlike any joint or fault previously encountered, with the additional note that the surface reflected lamplight differently from the surrounding andesite. None of these entries attracted attention at the time. The tunnel was a commercial project, not a research expedition. The crews were paid to advance footage, not to investigate geological curiosities. But the entries exist, scattered across thousands of pages of boring logs. 3 small anomalies in a 4-mile cross-section of a volcanic mountain. 3 points where the rock did not behave the way volcanic rock is supposed to behave. And none of them have ever been examined by anyone looking for what they might actually represent. The Comstock is not the only deep mine in Nevada where anomalous discoveries have been reported. The state's mining history spans over 160 years and encompasses thousands of shafts, tunnels, and open pits driven into volcanic, sedimentary, and metamorphic rock across the Great Basin. Mining company records from the 19th and early 20th centuries are scattered across state archives, university collections, and private holdings. Within those records, references to anomalous subsurface features appear with a frequency that exceeds what random geological variation would predict. In 1903, miners at the Tonopah Mining Company in Nye County reported finding a chamber at depth containing stone fragments with what they described as carved surfaces. The fragments had symmetrical shapes and flat faces that the crew said looked deliberate. They were collected by the shift boss and placed in the company office. The shift boss told a visiting journalist from the Tonopah Bonanza that the fragments did not look like anything produced by the rock they were mining. The fragments were never formally analysed, and their current location is unknown. In 1911, A prospector sinking a shaft near Lovelock in Pershing County struck a layer of hardened material at 40 feet that he described in his claim filing as cemented blocks arranged in a flat surface. The claim filing survives in the county recorder's office. No follow-up investigation was conducted. In 1934, workers expanding the Getchell gold mine in Humboldt County encountered a void at depth that contained artifacts described as stone tools of unknown origin. The artifacts were sent to the mine's corporate office in Reno and disappeared from the record. Each of these accounts is fragmentary. Each survives only because someone wrote something down in an operational document that was filed and forgotten. None have been investigated. And the pattern they form, anomalous subsurface discoveries across the Great Basin, occurring independently across decades, reported by working miners with no connection to one another and no motive to fabricate, has never been compiled, mapped, or studied as a dataset. The reason the Comstock Wall has never been investigated is not conspiracy, it is structure. Archaeological sites are defined as places where human activity left traces on or near the surface. Deep subsurface features are classified as geological by default. A smooth wall at 3,000 feet is a geologist's problem, and geologists do not look for masonry, they look for mineralogy and fault mechanics. The mining companies have no incentive to report anomalies. A wall at depth is not silver. It is a curiosity at best and a liability at worst. Because public interest could mean regulatory attention, work stoppages, or legal complications, the safest response is to log it internally, seal the section, and move on. That is exactly what Consolidated Virginia did. Even if an archaeologist wanted to investigate, access is impossible. The shaft is sealed, the section plugged, the lower levels flooded with geothermal water. Reopening would cost tens of millions, and no institution has jurisdiction over an archaeological investigation at 3,000 feet beneath a played-out mine. The evidence is there, the means to reach it are not, and the framework that would need to authorize the investigation does not recognize the possibility that there is anything to find. The Comstock Lode produced over $400 million in silver and gold between 1859 and 1920, many billions in today's currency. It built Virginia City, funded the Union side of the Civil War, capitalized the Bank of California, and made fortunes that shaped the American West. It also produced at its deepest point a single shift log entry describing a smooth stone wall with regular texture at 3,000 feet beneath a volcanic mountain. That entry sits in an archive in Carson City. The foreman who wrote it, James Hennessy, filed it alongside pump pressure readings and equipment inventories, as though a masonry wall at 3,000 feet was just another line item in a bad shift. The Sutro Tunnel boring logs, with their 3 anomalous formations, sit in the same archive system, uncorrelated, unexamined, waiting. The Tonopah fragments, the Lovelock cemented blocks, the Getchell stone tools, all documented in operational records scattered across Nevada's county and state archives. None compiled. None cross-referenced. None examined by anyone trained to evaluate whether the features described are natural or constructed. The Comstock mines are closed. Virginia City is a tourist town now, saloons and souvenir shops built on top of the richest silver deposit in American history. Visitors ride the old Virginia and Truckee Railroad, tour a shallow demonstration mine shaft that goes down a safe 50 feet, and buy silver jewelry made from Comstock ore. Nobody tells them about the 3,000-foot level. Nobody mentions the shift log. Nobody points at the mountain and says there is something down there that 3 men saw, and a foreman wrote down, and a company sealed in concrete before anyone could look twice. Below those streets, miles of tunnels extend into Mount Davidson, most inaccessible, the deepest levels unmapped since they flooded. The 3,000-foot level is down there, sealed behind concrete poured 147 years ago. The wall that O'Brien called masonry is behind that concrete, in a drift filled with geothermal water that no one will ever pump out again. 3 miners saw it, 1 foreman wrote it down, 1 company sealed it shut. And the question of what is built into the rock at 3,000 feet beneath Mount Davidson remains exactly where the Consolidated Virginia Mining Company left it in 1878, buried, plugged, flooded, and permanently out of reach. The shift log is the only witness that survived. It is sitting in a filing cabinet in Carson City, in a folder that has not been opened since it was deposited. The wall cannot speak, but the log can, and nobody has read it.